They called her just a nurse. That's what Dr. Mercer said to the residents during morning handoff, loud enough for the entire ICU corridor to hear. Just a nurse questioning supply orders. He smiled like a wolf showing its teeth, and nobody corrected him. They didn't know she'd evacuated 12 wounded personnel under sustained enemy fire in Tikrit. They didn't know her call sign was tattooed on a Marine's forearm 3 rooms down, inked over his radial artery where his pulse still beat her name. The folded flag from her fallen teammate was hidden in her locker, triangle pressed, waiting. What happened next didn't just silence the room, it changed everything. The fluorescent lights of St. Michael's hummed their monotonous industrial song as Hannah Clarke pushed a med cart down the 3rd-floor corridor at 6:41 a.m. Rubber wheels squeaked softly against linoleum, a sound she'd learned to move through like water, unnoticed. Her scrubs were navy blue, wrinkled at the hems, the fabric loose enough to hide the limp she'd acquired in 2015 when shrapnel had nested itself between her femur and her future. The hospital didn't ask about old injuries. Hospitals were good at not asking questions if you kept your head down. The ICU smelled like antiseptic and machinery, the industrial cleanser they used to scrub floors mixing with the sharp metallic scent of ozone from the defibrillators. She'd learned that smell in another life, one where helicopters didn't stop screaming and blood was just information, just data to be read and acted upon. Here at St. Michael's, in San Antonio, in the life where nobody knew her name, blood was a problem to be flagged and reported through proper channels. She paused at the window of ICU E3. Commander Davis lay motionless on the bed, his chest rising and falling in mechanical rhythm with the ventilator. Sedated. Stable vitals. Post-op day 2 from an appendectomy that should have been routine. His left forearm rested on top of the blankets, and from this angle, through the reinforced glass, she couldn't see the tattoo. But she knew it was there. She'd recognized his name on the chart 3 days ago and had to excuse herself to the bathroom to breathe normally for 6 minutes straight. The ventilator wheezed its steady artificial rhythm. She stood perfectly still. Motion would draw attention. Attention was the last thing she needed. Hannah completed her medication rounds by 7:15 a.m., checked 3 sets of vitals, adjusted 1 foot drip on a post-op orthopedic patient, and made careful notes in the electronic system that she was monitoring supply stocks per protocol. The stock counts were wrong. They'd been wrong for 6 weeks. Dr. Mercer had ordered 340 units of 14-gauge angiocath needles last month, more than double what a 230-bed hospital could use in that time frame. The invoices showed they came from a vendor called MedTech Solutions. The same vendor that Dr. Mercer's brother-in-law owned. The math was simple. The implications were complicated. She didn't flag it. Not yet. Flagging things meant paperwork, meant being noticed, meant the kind of attention that got people questions they couldn't answer. People like her didn't ask questions about supply chains. People like her existed in the spaces between official records. Her locker was in the basement break room, the one that smelled like stale coffee and the ghost of someone's microwaved fish dinner from last week. She spun the combination, the 14th of July, 32, and pulled the door open. The cracked mug sat on the top shelf, white ceramic with faded blue letters, World's Okayest Nurse. She'd bought it at a gas station outside Amarillo 3 years ago, back when she was still learning how to be invisible. Below that, a dying succulent in a terracotta pot, its leaves turning brown at the edges because she kept forgetting to water it. That seemed fitting. Things died around her. It was part of the pattern. She reached beneath her spare scrubs and touched the triangle. The flag was folded tight, military precise, the way it should be folded when someone had died under your watch and there was nothing left to give their family but cloth and ceremony. The flag from Tikrit. From Private First Class Marcus Chen. From the dust cloud that had swallowed his Humvee on a Tuesday that nobody would ever remember as important except for the 4 people who'd been in that vehicle and the 1 person who'd carried what was left of him across 2 kilometers of open ground while rounds cracked like thunder overhead. She didn't unfold it. She never unfolded it. Unfolding it would make it real again, and she'd spent 5 years learning how to make it not real. The door to the break room opened at 7:42 a.m. Dr. Mercer stood in the doorway with his coffee, a $6 dark roast from that place downtown, the kind that cost more than her entire morning break, and his eyes found her locker immediately. His gaze moved across the mug, the plant, and then to her face with the precision of a man conducting an inventory. He was 48 years old, which she knew from his employee profile because she'd looked it up on the hospital portal while doing credential verification. He had practiced at 3 other hospitals before St. Michael's. All 3 hospitals had structural problems with their supply chain audits during his tenure. Ah, Clarke. His voice was smooth, cultured, the kind of voice that had probably worked on admissions committees and hospital boards. Still here early, I see. Commendable work ethic. Not all nurses have it, you know. Some of them just punch a clock. She closed her locker quietly. The click of the lock sounded like a rifle bolt closing. She turned to face him, and her expression was the one she perfected over 5 years, neutral, respectful, the mask of a person with no history and no edges. "Morning, Dr. Mercer." He smiled. "How long have you been with us now? Feels like you just arrived, but I'm told it's been almost 2 years. Time flies." He took a sip of his coffee, and the steam rose in front of his face like a veil. "Tell me, how do you find our supply chain here?" "Adequate." The question wasn't innocent. His eyes were too bright, too focused. He was watching for a reaction the way a predator watches for prey. This was stage 1 of something. She could feel the machinery starting to move. "Everything seems sufficient," Hannah said. "I haven't had any issues completing orders." "Good, good." He nodded, and his smile widened just slightly. "Because I'd hate to think anyone on my team had concerns about operational procedures. Concerns can be disruptive. They require investigation, documentation, meetings with administration. Very time-consuming. Very exhausting for the person raising the concern." He set his coffee cup down on the counter beside her locker. "Some people can't handle that kind of scrutiny. Some people have backgrounds that don't bear up well under close examination." The room didn't change. The fluorescent lights didn't flicker. But something shifted in the air, the kind of pressure change that came before a storm. She'd felt that pressure in Kandahar. She'd felt it in the moments before everything went wrong in Tikrit. She met his eyes. Her jaw didn't clench. Her voice didn't waver. "I'm sure it would all be fine. I'm sure it would." He picked his coffee back up. "We do background checks, you know. On everyone. Sometimes they reveal interesting things. Sometimes they reveal nothing at all. Blank spaces. Red flags." He paused at the door. "Anyway. Good work on the floor. Keep that up." The door swung closed behind him, and Hannah stood motionless in the break room, breathing steadily through her nose. The smell of his expensive coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the stale smell of the microwave and someone's leftover tuna sandwich from last week. The fluorescent lights buzzed their endless industrial song. In ICU E3, Commander Davis slept beneath sedation and machines, unaware that the woman who dragged him through Tikrit dust was standing 1 floor below him, making calculations about survival. The fluorescent lights buzzed their endless industrial song. In ICU E3, Commander Davis slept beneath sedation and machines, unaware that the woman who dragged him through Tikrit dust was standing 1 floor below him, making calculations about survival. But those calculations were about to become irrelevant. Dr. Mercer had other plans. The grand rounds began at 7:48 a.m. on a Wednesday, which meant 12 residents and 4 attending physicians filed into Commander Davis's ICU room like they owned it. Dr. Mercer led the procession with the kind of walk that suggested he'd never once questioned whether the room belonged to him. Hannah was checking the ventilator settings when he arrived, her hand steady on the equipment, her eyes on the numbers climbing across the monitor display. 78% oxygen saturation. Holding steady. She'd been up since 5 a.m., watching this man's metrics like they were her own heartbeat. "Nurse Clarke," Mercer announced, loud enough for the glass walls to carry his voice into the hallway. "Perfect timing. Tell our residents what you observe about Commander Davis's current status. Hannah didn't look at him. She finished the notation in the chart first. Documentation was discipline, and discipline kept her invisible. When she spoke, her voice was level and clinical. Ventilator support stable. O2 saturation 78% on current settings. Heart rate 82, regular sinus rhythm. Urine output adequate. No signs of infection at the central line site. The resident scribbled notes like she'd said something profound. She hadn't. She'd said facts. Mercer smiled. It was the kind of smile that predators wear. Textbook regurgitation, he said, gesturing at the monitors like they were props in a play he was directing. Notice how nurse clipboard here follows protocols exactly as written. No clinical intuition. No adaptation. She reads the machines, she reads the chart, she delivers what the chart tells her to deliver. Tell me, nurse, what would you do if Commander Davis developed a new arrhythmia that wasn't covered in your little protocols? Hannah's jaw tightened. Not visibly. Just enough that her teeth pressed together for a fraction of a second. I would notify the attending physician immediately, she said. Exactly. You would defer. You would wait. You would let someone with actual training make the decision. Mercer turned to the residents, his voice dropping into the conspiratorial tone of someone sharing wisdom. This is what happens when nursing schools graduate people who mistake memorization for medicine. A competent robot might serve us better. At least a robot wouldn't develop independent notions about supply ordering. The residents exchanged glances. One of them, a fourth year with the kind of jawline that suggested his father had been a surgeon too, looked almost embarrassed for her. Hannah stood perfectly still. Her eyes locked on a point on the wall behind Mercer's head, a small crack in the paint that she'd noticed 3 days ago. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't accelerate. The cold flat stare was so complete that Mercer actually checked to see if she was still conscious. He waited for a reaction. Anything. A flinch. A flush. Some indication that his words had landed. Nothing. The silence lasted exactly 6 seconds before he turned back to the residents and launched into a discussion about post-operative cardiac complications, his voice bright and authoritative, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd never been refused anything in his entire life. Hannah finished her checks, documented everything with surgical precision, and was gone before Mercer finished his lecture about the importance of physician oversight. The vending machine encounter happened 3 days later at 13:24 during her lunch break. Hannah had chosen the route that avoided the main corridors, the back stairs, the third-floor hallway, the alcove where the ancient vending machines hummed like injured animals. She needed 5 minutes where no one spoke to her, where her hands weren't moving, where she could stand in front of a machine that dispensed stale coffee and make a simple choice. Dr. Mercer materialized like he'd been waiting in the walls. I've been reviewing your supply requisitions, he said, and his voice had a different texture now, sharper, thinner, the sound of someone whose patience was wearing through like old fabric. You question every vendor. You cross-reference every order. You actually have the audacity to suggest that my equipment selections might be excessive. Hannah didn't respond. She inserted her dollar bill. The machine accepted it with mechanical reluctance. I'm a physician with 23 years of experience and board certifications that would take you a lifetime to understand. I have relationships with hospital administration that predate your employment here. And you, he paused, letting the word hang in the air between them like a threat, you are a nurse. Do you understand the hierarchy here? The coffee cup dropped with the sound of something breaking inside the machine. You question my orders again, you escalate any concern to administration, you look at me with anything other than professional deference, and I will have security escort you from this hospital personally. Your next job application will be met with a phone call explaining that you're a troublemaker with boundary issues. Do we understand each other? Hannah retrieved her coffee. It was lukewarm and smelled like it had been sitting in the machine since Tuesday. She turned to face him, and something in her eyes shifted, not anger, something colder than anger. Something like recognition. Men who need this many words usually have the least to say, she said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It sounded like a scalpel sliding through silk, precise, inevitable, leaving no doubt about the damage. She turned and walked back toward the stairs, leaving Mercer standing in front of the vending machines with his coffee trembling in his hand and his mouth forming words that his brain hadn't authorized yet. The humming of the machine seemed louder after she left, and for the first time in 23 years, Dr. Mercer experienced the sensation of being unseen by someone standing directly in front of him. The following week, Mercer escalated. That was the word for it, escalated. He intercepted her near the pharmacy on a Friday afternoon when his timing could be perfect, his leverage visible. A security guard stood exactly 23 feet away, close enough to respond to a gesture, far enough away that he wouldn't naturally overhear a conversation. "I've had productive conversations with hospital administration regarding your attitude problem," Mercer said, and his voice had transformed into something professional and polished, the kind of voice that would sound reasonable to any witness. "One more instance of insubordination, one more question about my orders, one word spoken with anything less than professional respect, and that security officer will escort you to the parking lot. Permanently. Your career at St. Michael's will be over. Is that absolutely clear?" Hannah didn't respond immediately. Her jaw tightened, barely perceptible, just the muscles tensing beneath the surface, a flicker of restraint so disciplined that only someone trained to read bodies could have seen it. She was a nurse, which meant she'd been trained to absorb verbal abuse like concrete absorbs rain. But she was also something else, something that Mercer had no framework for understanding. "Clear," she said finally, and walked past him with her badge clipped to her scrubs and her head level. That night, during the quiet hours when the hospital shifted into its secondary rhythm and the staff became skeletons and ghosts, Hannah stood in front of her locker for longer than necessary. The locker was small, 18 inches wide, 4 feet tall, painted institutional gray. Inside, her spare scrubs hung in military folds. Her shoes were arranged by use. And hidden behind the spare shoes, wrapped in plastic and folded with the precision of someone who handled grief like a weapon, was a flag. Not a full flag. A triangle. Tri-folded. The colors were muted now, red faded to the color of rust, white yellowed like old bone, blue the shade of a sky seen through helicopter smoke. It had been folded by hands at a ceremony she hadn't been allowed to attend. A Marine she'd carried through the streets of Fallujah, bleeding out against her shoulder, the kind of bleeding that didn't stop because it came from inside. She'd kept the flag in violation of every regulation, hidden it like a secret that could destroy her, held it like the only piece of her erased identity that still existed in physical form. Her fingers brushed the plastic, but she didn't open it. Some things didn't need to be examined twice. Then, at 2:07 on a Tuesday morning when the hospital had contracted down to its skeleton crew and Commander Davis had been sleeping peacefully through sedation for 18 days without complication, the machines above his bed began to sing a different song. Not the regular beeping of normal cardiac rhythm. Something irregular. Something that escalated. Ventricular tachycardia at 2:08. Fibrillation at 2:09. Asystole, flat line, at 2:11. Hannah was on the third floor charting vitals for her other patients when the monitor alarm sounded. She heard it before anyone else because she'd trained herself to hear it, to let it penetrate the layers of exhaustion that accumulated after years of 12-hour shifts. She moved without thinking, thinking came after, thinking came for people who had the luxury of time. The crash cart was 3 floors away. The overnight ICU had 2 RNs and 1 LPN covering 12 beds. The attending cardiologist was in the hospital but on the 4th floor in the emergency department managing a massive anterior wall MI that had rolled in at midnight. The time to help arrived was measured in minutes, and Commander Davis's brain would begin dying at the 4-minute mark. Hannah moved down the corridor with a stride that covered distance without wasting motion. Behind her, the alarm continued its mechanical panic, the kind of sound that made the air itself feel thin. She was first to the room, first to the bed, first to see that the monitors were showing exactly what she'd feared. Ventricular fibrillation. No pulse. No blood moving to his brain. An LPN materialized in the doorway, frozen in the universal posture of someone watching a catastrophe unfold. "I'll get the cart," she stammered, but she wasn't moving. She was standing there processing the fact that Commander Davis, stable, solid, recovering well, was suddenly not alive in any way that mattered. Hannah's hands found the external defibrillator pads by feel. She'd placed them 1,000 times. Her eyes registered the monitor reading, registered the collapsed neck veins, registered the muffled heart sounds that shouldn't exist. Tamponade. Blood accumulated in the pericardial sac, compressing the heart until it couldn't beat. A complication from the surgery that Mercer had overseen. A bleeding point that Mercer had missed or ignored or simply hadn't cared enough to check. 45 seconds remained before irreversible brain damage. The crash cart was 90 seconds away even if someone was running, which the LPN finally began to do. Hannah made the calculation in the same way she'd made calculations on a rooftop in Tikrit while rounds were snapping past her head. Some situations had no good options. Some situations had only the option that didn't involve death. She sprinted to her locker. The combination came to her fingers without conscious thought. 18 years of military training meant that certain muscle memories transcended civilian life. The locker opened. Her trauma bag sat in the bottom like a relic, the canvas worn soft from use, the weight of it familiar as her own heartbeat. Inside, beneath the compression bandages and the hemostatic gauze and the sutures that shouldn't exist in a civilian nurse's possession, was the knife. Combat blade. Ka-bar. 14 inches of steel that had been with her through Fallujah and Sanjin and the operation in Tikrit that had gone sideways and resulted in her erasure from every official record. She'd never been able to leave it behind because leaving it behind would mean admitting that she'd stopped being what she'd been. 30 seconds now. Back to ICU 3. The LPN was still running for the cart, her footsteps echoing off the tile in a rhythm that sounded like panic. Hannah moved to Commander Davis's bedside with the kind of calm that only came from having already experienced the worst thing that could happen. She prepped the chest with betadine, the iodine smell cutting through the antiseptic sterility of the ICU. No sterile field. No time for the protocols that Mercer loved so much. No time for anything except the blade in her hands and 23 years of medical training embedded in muscle memory and bone. She made the incision between the ribs, left anterolateral thoracotomy, the technique burned into her brain by instructors in a military hospital she wasn't supposed to have attended. Through the intercostal muscles. Into the chest cavity. The blood was warm and thick, the sound of it like rain on a tent, the smell of copper so complete that for a moment she was back in Tikrit, back in the moment that had created her call sign, back in the moment that had taught her that some people weren't meant to live quiet lives. She relieved the tamponade with her hands and the knife, found the bleeding point in the pulmonary vein, and closed it with sutures while the monitor still showed flatline and the clock showed 42 seconds had elapsed. Her hands moved like they belonged to someone else, like she was watching herself from outside her own body, like the woman holding the knife was a different person entirely from the woman who'd been questioned about her competence in grand rounds. Sinus rhythm. Sudden. Clean. Real. The monitor began to beep like it had permission to exist again. The O2 saturation climbed, 54%, 62%, 70%. His blood pressure registered at 82/55. Low, but alive. Alive was the first metric that mattered. Everything else was negotiation. She was closing the chest with standard surgical thread when Dr. Mercer arrived with the crash team, his white coat trailing behind him like a cape, his face cycling through shock and disbelief before settling into something colder. The crash cart arrived 43 seconds later, useless now. The trauma team filed in expecting to find a code in progress. Instead they found a field thoracotomy performed with surgical precision on an ICU bed by a woman in scrubs with blood on her hands and a combat knife on the instrument tray beside her. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze its mechanical rhythm, steady and certain, pushing life into a man who'd been flatlined 60 seconds ago. "What the hell have you done?" Mercer's voice cracked like thin ice. Hannah finished her last suture, her hands completely steady, her breathing completely normal. She looked up at him with eyes that had seen things he couldn't imagine and survived things he couldn't survive. "My job," she said. And that was when everything changed. The monitors shrieked at 2 in the morning. Hannah had been restocking the ICU supply cart when the alarm erupted, a sound like a fire siren inside her chest. She didn't run. Running meant panic. She walked, fast and measured, past the night shift nurse whose hand was already reaching for the crash cart button. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and flickered as if the building itself was panicking. Commander Davis's heart was in ventricular tachycardia. The rhythm on the monitor looked like a seismic fault line, jagged, chaotic, desperate. His oxygen saturation was dropping, 92, 88, 81. The full line in his arm was still clear from post-op, but the surgical repair that should have held wasn't holding. Something had ruptured inside his chest cavity. She could see it in the way his skin was graying, the subtle shift in his breathing pattern, the tremor in his fingertips that said his heart was working against itself. Crash cart's coming, the night nurse said. Young, maybe 3 years into the job. Confidence without experience. 5 minutes, Hannah said quietly. Not a question. She'd timed these hallways on her first shift. He doesn't have 5 minutes. The monitor flatlined into ventricular fibrillation. Hannah was already moving. Her hands didn't shake. Her hands never shook. She grabbed the defibrillation pads, standard protocol, the kind move everyone made in crises. But her eyes were already scanning the rest of the room, measuring distances, calculating oxygen drop rates and blood loss trajectories with the precision of someone who'd done this before in conditions far worse than a sterile hospital ICU. Tickrit. A mortar round had punched through a concrete wall 6 inches from where she'd been standing, and the Marines she pulled from that rubble had needed exactly what this man needed now. Push 1 epi, she said to the LPN, her voice level. Not a request. A command. The young nurse moved without hesitation. That's what happened when someone spoke with absolute certainty. Hannah pressed the defibrillation pads to Davis's chest. The machine charged. His body convulsed once, twice. The monitor line stayed flat. His oxygen saturation was in the 60s now. Brain death threshold was for minutes at this level. She pulled her hand from her scrub pocket where she always kept it, a habit from deployments, a reflex older than her nursing license. The combat knife, 6 inches of steel with a handle worn smooth by hands that had held it through 3 tours. The blade was dark titanium, sharp enough to cut through Kevlar if it had to. It was beautiful in the way that functional things are beautiful, designed for one purpose and perfected at it. I need a 6-inch incision, she said. Her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. 4th and 5th intercostal space, left side. Get me retractors, 4.0 silk sutures, and a satin sky clamp if we have one. Probably don't. The LPN stared at her. Hannah had already made the incision. The blade went through skin and fascia with a feeling like cutting paper. Blood welled immediately, she could smell it, that copper salt smell that meant tissue damage and oxygen debt. The fluorescent light overhead seemed impossibly bright, turning everything into high-definition reality. Her other hand was already moving, separating the intercostal muscles with a spreading motion that took maybe 3 seconds. The rib cage opened like a door she'd learned how to unlock years ago in a place with different uniforms and a different kind of casualty list. There. His left ventricle. Lacerated. The post-op repair had failed, maybe a suture had slipped, maybe there had been undiagnosed trauma during surgery, maybe just bad luck and bad timing. It didn't matter now. What mattered was that the hole needed to close. Sutures. Now. Her hands moved with the precision of someone trained in combat medicine, of someone who'd performed field procedures under mortar fire with shaking hands before she learned to make them stop shaking. The knife came away and was replaced by the needle without her thinking about it. Her fingers knew the angles, the tension, the way the silk thread had to bite into myocardium tissue to hold against internal pressure. 1 stitch. 2. 3. The bleeding slowed as her hands worked with a fluid certainty that looked like dance to anyone watching but felt like muscle memory to her, like her body was remembering something her mind had been told to forget. The door burst open. The crash team arrived with their cart and their protocols and their confusion. The attending physician's face went through 3 distinct expressions in the span of a second: shock, anger, and something that looked like recognition of the fact that his patient's heart was already beating again under her hands. "What the hell are you?" he started. "Exit wound sealed," Hannah said. Her voice hadn't changed. She was still working, still closing. "He's going to need a formal repair in OR, but his vitals are stabilizing. O2 sat 72 and climbing." The senior resident stepped forward and Hannah felt rather than saw the moment she became a problem instead of a solution. A nurse. An ICU nurse. With a combat knife that was still in her hand, already cleaned on her scrubs before she set it carefully on the surgical tray. "Get me more silk," she said, and no one moved to argue. Command voice didn't come from yelling. It came from the certainty of someone who'd made split-second decisions that meant whether people lived or died, and she had the scar tissue to prove it, literally, visible on her left forearm where shrapnel had caught her during the evacuation she performed on Davis himself, years ago in Tikrit, when she was someone else wearing a different uniform and a call sign on her boots. The sutures took 7 minutes. Davis's heart rate steadied at 104, elevated but stable. The O2 saturation climbed past 90. The attending watched the entire procedure without interruption, which meant he was either too stunned to speak or he understood exactly what he was watching, a military trauma surgeon moving through a routine she could have performed blindfolded. When Hannah finished, she set down the needle and stepped back. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. There was blood on her forearms and her scrubs, but her face was completely composed, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse, that comes from 3 tours and a list of casualties she'd never been able to forget. "He needs a thoracic surgeon," she said quietly. "That repair is temporary. But he's stable enough for transport." That was the last instruction she gave. The attending called hospital security at 02 for 7 hours. The LPN, young and nervous and already worried about what she'd witnessed, started making calls of her own to nurses she knew in other departments. By breakfast, everyone at St. Michael's knew that Hannah Clarke had performed surgery in the ICU with a combat knife she'd been carrying in her pocket. The story got bigger with every telling, a knife she'd pulled from nowhere, a procedure no civilian nurse should have known, hands that moved like they'd done it 1,000 times before. Dr. Mercer arrived at 0630 hours. He didn't go to the ICU first. He went to administration. Hannah found the reassignment notice in the staff lounge at 0730 hours, printed and waiting in her cubby like someone had known exactly when she'd arrive. Effective immediately, she was being transferred to the pediatric wing. Loss of ICU privileges pending investigation. The clinical language didn't hide what it meant. She was being removed from access to anything important, from anywhere near Commander Davis, from anywhere near the supply records that showed Dr. Mercer's inflated equipment orders. She read it once. Didn't crumple it. Didn't curse. Didn't do anything except nod slightly and pocket the notice. The locker door opened when she twisted the combination 17, 34, 8, and she began removing her things with the methodical precision of someone dismantling a life. The stethoscope. The reference books. The photograph of her unit that she kept hidden behind a small bottle of hand sanitizer. And underneath, wrapped in protective tissue, the folded flag from her fallen teammate. The one piece of her erased past she'd kept. An older nurse, Martha, who'd been kind on day 1, sat down on the bench beside her. "They're saying you saved the commander's life." Hannah didn't answer immediately. She was holding the folded flag, and her hands were very still. "I did my job," Hannah said finally. Martha waited, as if expecting more. "That's what we do," Hannah continued quietly. "That's what we're here for." But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Mercer had already anticipated this response. Even as Hannah was packing her locker, even as the clinical machinery of the hospital was beginning to turn against her, an investigator was being contacted, a retired physician who specialized in unauthorized procedures, a man who owed Dr. Mercer several professional favors. And when that investigator ran Hannah's background check, when the system flagged that classified security clearance buried so deep it had been dormant for 5 years. When Pentagon protocols activated automatically at 0900 hours, everyone's understanding of the situation was going to change. Hannah Clarke wasn't just a nurse who'd overstepped her authority. Hannah Clarke was a ghost, a name that shouldn't exist in any official capacity, a classified operative who'd been ordered to disappear. And she'd just announced her presence on a combat thoracotomy in a hospital full of witnesses who would document it, photograph it, report it. She'd saved Commander Davis's life, and in doing so, she'd destroyed the anonymity she'd been given as the price of survival. The only question now was whether the people coming to find her would come as rescuers or as something far worse. Dr. Mercer arrived at the ICU 7 minutes after the emergency code ended. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the tile in a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, controlled, purposeful, the gait of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. What he found instead was Commander Davis breathing on his own, oxygen saturation climbing toward normal, and a surgical site closed with textbook precision. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm, sinus, stable, alive. Hannah stood beside the bed, vital sheet in hand, refusing to meet his eyes. She didn't need to. Mercer saw everything he needed in the way her hands were steady, in the way she'd moved without panic, in the way a patient who should have died was asking for water. He left the ICU without a word. But his mind was already moving through his network like current through copper wire, calculating, activating, destroying. The first call came at 18:47 hours. Martin Caldwell, Chief Executive Officer of St. Michael's, answered on the second ring. Mercer had covered for Caldwell's malpractice settlement 3 years prior, a surgical error that should have cost the hospital $3.2 million but instead disappeared into the fog of adjusted billing codes and reclassified incident reports. Caldwell owed him. Men like Caldwell understood debt the way other men understood air. "We have a situation," Mercer said quietly, his voice pitched low and conspiratorial. "One of our nurses performed an unauthorized procedure on a critical patient. Thoracotomy. With a knife. She violated every protocol in our manual. I stopped her, of course, but the damage to hospital liability is catastrophic. We need to terminate her immediately, before she kills someone else. Before word gets out." It wasn't entirely a lie. Mercer had perfected the art of the half-truth, the kind that made people fill in the blanks with their own fears. Caldwell had built his career on avoiding liability. The prospect of an unlicensed cardiac surgery would keep him awake at night. "What's her name?" Caldwell asked. "Hannah Clarke. ICU staff. She's been here 3 years, quiet, no red flags on paper. But her judgment is compromised. I'm recommending immediate termination and a review by legal." The second set of calls came at 19:23 hours. Mercer had Hannah's personnel file open on his desk, her previous employers highlighted in yellow. He knew people at Parkland in Dallas. He knew people at Houston Methodist. He knew people everywhere, because people like Mercer networked the way spiders spun webs, methodically, patiently, with every strand connected to every other strand. "I'm calling about a former employee," Mercer said to the nurse manager at Parkland, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of professional concern. "Hannah Clarke. She worked ICU there about 5 years ago. I'm conducting a reference check, and frankly, I'm troubled by some decisions she made under pressure. Unauthorized interventions. Lack of protocol adherence. Has she caused any problems for you?" The nurse manager paused. "I don't recall that name." "That's odd. She lists your facility on her resume. 3 years, she claimed. ICU trauma." Another pause. "Our records don't show anyone by that name." Mercer felt something like satisfaction settle in his chest. A phantom employee. No verifiable history. Just a woman with a gap in her past that screamed classified, secretive, hidden. Exactly what he needed. He repeated the call for more times, building the narrative carefully. Each hospital he contacted, he planted the same seed, a nurse with questionable judgment, unauthorized procedures, a pattern of recklessness. The story didn't need to be true. It needed to be plausible, and plausible meant documented, meant traceable, meant the kind of concern that HR departments took seriously. The external investigator arrived at St. Michael's on Wednesday morning, carrying the kind of briefcase that contained subpoena authority. Her name was Dr. Patricia Holloway, a credentialing specialist with 17 years of investigative experience. She'd worked for hospital networks across the Southwest, and she had the kind of face that suggested she'd seen every lie a healthcare provider could construct. Mercer had hired her personally. He'd paid her directly. And he'd given her a single directive: determine if Hannah Clarke's credentials were legitimate. Holloway's investigation took 32 hours. She started with the obvious: medical licensing databases, nursing board records, credential verification through the state. Everything checked out. Hannah Clarke held a valid Texas RN license, her continuing education was current, her background was clean. Too clean, in fact. No prior employers who would verify directly. No school records more recent than 12 years old. No digital footprint that extended beyond what was necessary for employment. When Holloway cross-referenced Hannah's social security number against federal databases, the system returned a flag she'd never encountered before. A classification level that shouldn't exist for a civilian healthcare worker. She picked up the phone and called the Pentagon's Office of Personnel Security. The woman who answered took Holloway's information, placed her on hold for exactly 90 seconds, and when she returned, her voice had changed. "You need to stand down on this investigation," the woman said. "That individual is protected under federal classification protocols. Any further inquiry requires clearance authorization from JSOC." Holloway hung up the phone and understood instantly she had just stumbled into something that lived in a category beyond her clearance level. Hannah received her termination notice at 1,410 hours on Thursday afternoon. HR Director Patricia Simmons delivered it in person, which meant security was involved. Security meant this wasn't a negotiation. Simmons was a woman who terminated employees for 2 decades without once making eye contact, and she maintained that precision now. Effective immediately, your employment at St. Michael's is terminated for reckless endangerment and violation of established medical protocols, Simmons read, her voice reciting the language of corporate protection. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your address on file. You have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings. A security officer will accompany you. Hannah nodded. She didn't ask questions. Questions suggested surprise, suggested that something about this was unexpected. She'd known the moment the knife left her pocket that the cost would be calculated by people who understood what she was. Now she was simply paying it. The locker opened to the smell of antiseptic and metal. Her scrubs hung on the hook where she'd placed them that morning, already a lifetime ago. The cracked mug sat on the shelf, ceramic and dishwasher scarred, the kind of thing that accumulated meaning through repetition rather than beauty. The succulent had finally given up its fight for survival 3 days prior, the leaves turning brown and papery, the soil completely dry. She placed both in the cardboard box the security officer had provided. The photograph came last. 12 faces arranged in front of a Humvee in Tikrit, the sun bleached and white in the background, the kind of light that burned everything it touched. She'd marked one face with a pen, a circle around the Marine whose name she wasn't allowed to speak anymore, whose femoral bleed she couldn't stop even with both hands inside the wound, even with 6 units of whole blood and a prayer that the Pentagon said she was no longer allowed to make. The folded flag from his service sat at the bottom of her locker. She'd kept it for 5 years against explicit orders, against the terms of her erasure, against everything she'd agreed to when they told her Captain Hannah Clarke no longer existed. She picked it up now, felt the weight of it, perhaps 2 ounces of fabric, perhaps the heaviest thing she'd ever held, and placed it in the box on top of the photo. The security officer escorted her through the hospital corridors. Nurses she'd worked with for 3 years averted their eyes. The ones who met her gaze held expressions of confusion, as if they were seeing a stranger wearing Hannah's face. To them, she was already disappearing. Within a week, she would be erased from the memory of St. Michael's as completely as she'd been erased from military records, from official documentation, from history itself. The rain started as she exited through the main entrance. Not a gentle rain, but the kind that came with purpose in San Antonio in the evenings, warm and sudden and drenching. She crossed the street to the bus stop, the cardboard box already absorbing moisture, the bottom beginning to soften. She stood there holding it like a saint holding relics, and watched St. Michael's Hospital continue its operations behind her. In the ICU, monitors beeped their electronic hymns. In the OR, surgeons prepared for the next patient. In the administrative offices, Dr. Mercer was already preparing his defense, already certain that he'd won, already blind to the machinery he'd just triggered. In the ICU, Commander Davis opened his eyes for the first time since the knife had saved his life. His vision swam, then cleared, then sharpened into focus. A nurse he didn't recognize was adjusting his fall, young, competent, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd seen plenty. He tried to speak, failed, tried again. The woman, he rasped. From surgery. The one who cut. The LPN checked the chart, her fingers tracing the notes. Hannah Clarke? She was terminated this morning. Davis went rigid. Every muscle in his chest contracted, pulling against the new sutures, sending white-hot pain through his torso. But pain was information, and the information was urgent. He fumbled for his phone with a shaking hand, the one without the 4, and pulled up a number he hadn't dialed in 3 years. The voice that answered was military, precise, expecting nothing. "Sir," Davis said. "I need a unit at St. Michael's in San Antonio. Marines, dressed. Now. I just found out who saved my life in Tikrit, and the hospital just fired her." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Say that again, Commander." "Reaper 6. She's real. She's been here the whole time, and they just fired her for saving my life. For doing the procedure that should have come in the next 5 minutes as an operating room emergency. She did it in the ICU with a knife. We need to move now." By 1900 hours, boots were on tile. For Marines in dress blues, their uniforms pressed with the kind of precision that made every civilian fabric look like rags, marched through St. Michael's entrance. Behind them came a 2-star general whose name had authority written into every feature of his face. Behind him came a Pentagon liaison carrying a leather portfolio embossed with the Department of Defense seal. They moved directly to Dr. Mercer's office, where Mercer sat with Caldwell and 2 board members, celebrating the termination with expensive scotch and the kind of self-satisfaction that only comes from believing you've eliminated a threat. The general didn't knock. He pushed through the door the way men with power pushed through doors, as a statement, not a request. "Dr. Mercer. We're looking for Hannah Clarke." Mercer stood, his confidence still intact. "She was terminated." "We know what you did," the Pentagon liaison said. His voice carried the kind of weight that made boardroom voices seem like child's play. "Where is she?" Security footage placed Hannah at the bus stop across from the hospital, holding a disintegrating cardboard box in the rain. A Marine officer retrieved her personally. She didn't resist. She didn't ask questions. She simply followed them back into St. Michael's, back into the place she'd been erased from, back into the machinery that had already decided her fate. The hospital's routine background check arrived on a Tuesday morning at 08 for 7 hours, filed as standard termination paperwork, delivered to a desk that was no longer Hannah's. The administrative clerk scanning documents didn't notice anything unusual until the system flagged a security clearance so buried, so classified, that the hospital's entire network triggered a Pentagon protocol, the kind of alert that doesn't get ignored. Within 90 minutes, the system had locked down. Within 3 hours, the Pentagon knew St. Michael's had fired a woman who technically didn't exist in any official capacity. Commander Davis regained full consciousness at 1,423 hours on that same Tuesday, his chest wrapped in bandages that would hold the scar of Hannah's field thoracotomy for the rest of his life. His eyes tracked the fluorescent lights first, then the 4 lines, then the monitor showing a steady rhythm, a rhythm that meant he was alive when he shouldn't have been. The nurse checking his vitals told him he'd been sedated for 36 hours, that his surgery had been unconventional, that he should wait for the doctor. Davis nodded, waited until she left, then reached for the stack of papers on his bedside table. His hands were weak, but his eyes were clear. He found it in the discharge notes, the termination letter. Hannah Clarke. Fired for reckless endangerment. The words blurred for a moment, then his voice came out rough as gravel, Reaper 6. Just a whisper. Just a call sign that belonged to a woman who'd evacuated him under fire in Tikrit 6 years ago, a woman with steady hands and eyes like ice water, a woman who'd told him she was just a nurse and then saved 12 Marines by moving through hell like she owned it. His hand moved to his left forearm, to the tattoo he'd had inked the day he recovered enough to leave Walter Reed, her call sign, centered over his heart in military letters. She was alive. She was here. And they'd fired her. Davis reached for the call button, but the door opened before he could press it. The entrance brought with it the sound of boots, not the soft shoes of hospital staff, but the precise click of military-issue footwear on linoleum. A Marine delegation entered, dressed blues pressed sharp as razors, carrying a leather folder that moved like it contained something heavier than paper. The colonel leading them nodded to Davis. "Commander. You're clear-headed." Davis answered with a single word, "Sir." The colonel opened the folder and read in a voice that made the walls straighten up, "Captain Hannah Clarke. For extraordinary valor in Tikrit, evacuating 12 wounded personnel under sustained enemy fire, rendering life-saving first aid while exposed to active engagement, maintaining command presence under conditions that would have broken most soldiers. The Silver Star is hereby restored to your record, along with formal acknowledgement of classified operations designation Reaper 6. Davis's eyes filled. The colonel continued reading, each sentence another weight lifted from Hannah's shoulders, recognition of the operation, the casualties she'd prevented, the decision she'd made that day that had cost her everything when she came home. The general who'd arrived behind the colonel stepped forward, his uniform so decorated it caught the light. He saluted Hannah Clarke even though she wasn't in the room. Even though she didn't know what was about to happen. Even though she was standing in the rain at a bus stop with a cardboard box containing everything she had left. The general's arrival at St. Michael's came at 1,659 hours. A two-star general doesn't enter a hospital quietly. He enters with Marines, with the kind of presence that makes a CEO suddenly develop an interest in their shoes. He walked directly to the conference room where Dr. Mercer was mid-sentence, explaining to the board about Hannah's recklessness, her lack of protocol, her unauthorized intervention. The general didn't sit. "Dr. Mercer. Step outside. Now." What happened next moved with the precision of a military operation. The hospital IT specialist, Rodriguez, a Navy veteran who'd served in communications and who'd always nodded respectfully to Hannah in the hallways, who'd always seen something in her that made him stand a little straighter, stepped forward with his laptop. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd been waiting for this moment since the moment he'd recognized her name on a termination notice. "About those security files you tried to delete," Rodriguez said. His voice was soft. The room went dead silent. The screen flickered to life. Parking garage footage, Dr. Mercer meeting with supply company representatives, signing documents, accepting an envelope thick with cash. His office at 0300 hours, his face lit by the blue glow of his computer screen, his fingers trembling as he attempted to wipe files that shouldn't exist. And then, the ICU footage from the night of the emergency. Hannah moving with the kind of precision that only came from experience, from training, from hours spent in conditions that would have killed most people. The knife entering the chest cavity. The fluid movements. Her hand steady as a surgical laser. Her voice calm as stone. And Mercer, nowhere. Not present. Not answering his phone. Not doing his job while his patient coded and a civilian nurse performed a military medical procedure that saved his life. Rodriguez connected the final file. Financial records spread across the screen like a confession. 18 months of phantom equipment orders. Surgical supplies that were never delivered. Kickback arrangements with 3 medical supply companies, each payment traced to accounts in Mercer's name. The amount scrolled by $47,000. $82,000. $156,000. The kind of money that came from equipment that Hannah Clarke had questioned in her quiet way, in her documentation, in her careful notes that had threatened to expose everything. I reported this to the State Medical Board at 0600 this morning, Rodriguez said. All of it. Before you could finish the cover-up. The general's phone rang. He answered, listened, and his expression didn't change. When he spoke, his voice was the kind of calm that precedes inevitability. The FBI is en route to discuss fraud charges. Dr. Mercer, you're invited to wait here or leave now. Either way, your medical license is suspended effective immediately pending federal investigation. Mercer tried one final gambit, turning to CEO Caldwell, tell them about our arrangement. Caldwell stood and walked out without a word. The door closed behind him with the finality of a vault ceiling. Mercer was left alone at the table, his face gray, his hands moving like they belonged to someone else, as the Marine stood at attention around the space where Hannah had been erased from the hospital's records but not from its obligation. The general stepped to the window, looking out toward the rain that had started to fall, and made a single call. Find her. She's at a bus stop somewhere in San Antonio. She's carrying a cardboard box. Bring her home. By 1847 hours, Hannah Clarke was in a government vehicle with a Marine on either side of her, the cardboard box placed carefully on the seat beside her as if it contained something sacred. The Marine who'd retrieved her from the bus stop had simply appeared, saluted, and said, Captain Clarke. You're needed at St. Michael's. She'd asked no questions. Captain Hannah Clarke didn't ask questions anymore. She just moved, because moving was what she did. The reckoning happened in a conference room at 1923 hours. The general presented her citation in full, reading the names of all 12 Marines she'd evacuated, reading the circumstances of an operation that had been so classified that even the Marines who'd survived had been told to forget it had happened. Hannah stood in her civilian clothes while a 3-star general read her military record aloud, and when he finished, he pinned a silver star to her chest. Then 2 purple hearts. Then a Navy cross that made the room exhale in unison. Commander Davis stood beside her, his chest wrapped in bandages, his arm rolled up so that her call sign was visible like a permanent declaration. His voice was steady when he spoke, Welcome home, Reaper 6. 6 months later, a private ceremony took place in a Pentagon conference room with no cameras and no press. Hannah stood in her dress blues, the uniform of a captain in the United States Marine Corps, and accepted the National Medal of Honor from a 3-star general who read her full citation in a room of 20 people, Pentagon officials, the Marines from her unit who'd survived Tikrit, and Rodriguez, standing at attention in his Navy dress whites. Davis stood beside her with tears streaming down his face, his sleeve rolled up, his forever reminder of the woman who'd refused to leave him behind. Hannah's voice didn't waver. I didn't save them for medals. I saved them because that's what we do. We don't leave people behind. Outside, in a rural clinic for hours from San Antonio, Dr. Mercer loaded medical supplies into a van. His medical license stripped. His board memberships revoked. His network dissolved after 3 former colleagues testified against him in exchange for reduced fraud charges. He drove a supply route now, delivering equipment he'd once stolen from. His phone rang with a blocked number. He didn't answer. Hannah returned to St. Michael's the following week as Director of Emergency Medicine. Her office contained 3 items, the cracked mug, repaired now with gold kintsugi that caught the light like a scar healed right. The photo from Tikrit in a frame. The folded flag in a glass case. On her wall, a plaque, Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. Commander Davis visited monthly for appointments he didn't need, just to stand in her office and remind the staff who'd saved his life. And every time he left, he rolled down his sleeve slowly, covering her call sign, keeping it close, keeping it safe. Thank you for being here. If you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. And we always love hearing from you. Drop a comment and tell us what state or country you're in.